Interesting conversation. Yeah, we get that a long time back. You guys are fine in there. Maybe New York. Sorry, in Washington. Maybe Washington. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have the actually my notes busy. But we can catch up with you on a road. Oh, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with our second panel discussion on the theme Next Generation Reforms in Insolvency. For this, I welcome Honorable Justice Kannan Ramesh, Judge, Supreme Court of Singapore and Singapore International Commercial Court on the dais. Mr. Ajit Niwad Cabral, former Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, has joined us online. Mr. James H.M. Spryer-Regan, founder Kirkland & Ellis, Worldwide Restructuring Group, Chicago. Professor Y.E. Van, Associate Dean and Professor, School of Law, City University of Hong Kong. Mr. Behram Vakil, founding partner of AZB Partners. And Mr. Suman Patra, founder, Insolvency Law Academy. Madam and sir, over to you for the discussion.
Thank you so much for the introductions. And good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for being here with us for this last session of the day. I'm sure you all have had a long day and are expecting that what is the last session of today, which is holding back you from going to wherever you would like to go, including the dinner after this, that this offers as a discussion something which is very stimulating, and I promise you that that is what we aim to do. So, and the topic is quite self-explanatory in this sense, what the session is going to be all about. But just to set the context, we are going to discuss as something which is about many balls that are still up in the air. We all know that there has been recently a discussion on a lot of topics where the government of India is contemplating reforms that already appear to be a big wave of reforms, something which is already being articulated by some to be as befitting of being called as IBC 2.0. And the reason for that is not just because of some of the corrective kind of changes that have been done in the past or expected, but the changes that are surely structural, very significant, are bold, also in many cases would be almost fit to be described as leap of faith, and also futuristic. Now, futuristic in the sense that not only from the point of view of India, where we stand today, and look at things incrementally, but as those that would propel India as a thought leader on IBC, which is that we are thinking way ahead of many other jurisdictions, many other areas. So that is why it is called as a next generation reforms. Now, there are quite many of them. It is going to be quite challenging for us to be able to cover all of them comprehensively and to be able to optimize on the presence of these experts from many jurisdictions with vast experience behind them, and also who are global thought leaders in their own right, in not just their own jurisdictions, but at the global head table of insolvency. And therefore, my attempt would be to try and extract every single piece of wisdom from them, which will help policymakers, many of you who are researching and looking at various topics more closely and intimately, and some of us who are associated with the reform process to be able to take benefit of those comments and observations in shaping our thought process. So first of all, thank you so much, all of you, and thank you, Nevad, for joining us from Colombo. I know that you wanted to make it personally, but last minute changes held you back from traveling, but I am quite sure that your presence here, even virtually, we will be able to make the most of. And I would, Nevad, for your benefit, at the end of towards the end of the session, leave certain comments for you to talk to us about how is Sri Lanka coping up at this point of time with the aftermath of the economic crisis. How are you dealing with some of the changes that are required or the reform measures that are required to deal with the issues that you confront with at this point in time, and what's the activity that is opening, but maybe happening, but a little later, towards the session. But of course, we would like your comments on almost all the aspects. Now, one of the first questions that would arise in everybody's mind when you hear this whole list, the bucket list of reform, next generation reform that we're going to be talking about is, including those that are structural and would actually be like tectonic plates shifting under the IBC. Are such changes welcomed so frequently in the lifespan of a law, any law, in particular an insolvency law? Are we making too many changes or making those changes too quickly? Does it have an implication or a bearing? Because I think these are questions that come from the market. These are issues that are raised by stakeholders, because some of them might just see this as too much overplay of some of the areas of insolvency. And I think therefore it's quite a valid question in that sense. But it'll be good to hear as to what is the international perspective of what's been happening in India over the last 7 years in terms of how the changes have happened, and how do jurisdictions away from India deal with these issues? So, Jamie, I'm going to ask you this. I know that we agreed that probably I'll start with just kind of an element of surprise, but you can handle that. So, I mean, what's your take on this? And you've been very actively associated with the market. You kept a very close eye. I mean, I kept getting these emails from you all the time of, these studies, these results of researches, opinions that are produced. They end up at your desk, and then you keep forwarding me. You'll find it interesting. Someone to read this. I mean, so you're so well aware of what's happening. What's your take on this particular issue? Call it concern or whatever.
Yeah, so what I would say, and by the way, thank you for having me and appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. What I would say is I would change the question a little bit, because I think it's important as to why the change is being made, and is it an improvement in the system, or is the change being made at the behest of one particular constituency or stakeholder that didn't like a result in a particular case. If it's the former, it doesn't really bother me that much that there's rapid changes, and I think there could be something good about that. If it's the latter, it doesn't matter whether that's fast or slow. Those are bad reasons generally for doing amendments. And I'm speaking somewhat from my experience in the United States. Since we put in our code in 1978, we've had literally multiple hundred amendments. And a whole bunch of them have been bad amendments because they've been driven by some constituency that felt they didn't get treated the way they wanted to in a particular case and lobbied Congress for a change. And that made our code worse. But there's been a whole bunch of other changes that were some dissatisfaction, which call it, what's best for the system and what's best for the American economy. And those changes have been accretive and an improvement. And so that's what I think it should be most concentrated on. I don't think if it's the type of changes that are improvements to the system, that it's a bad thing that it happens multiple times. You have a new system, you're constantly tweaking it. There are experiences. If a bad experience happens in more than one case and multiple times, then I think that now you can understand it. I would just caution against doing it based on one case because you're kind of fighting the last war there, and it might be bespoke and you think it applies to the whole system, and now you've sort of artificially changed things in a way that shouldn't have been done.
Well, thank you. Just Ramesh, you close at home. Singapore's been making some changes, in particular after 2016. I mean, there are changes because of adoption of one-set-all model law. There are changes because of how Singapore is positioning itself as a global hub of restructuring. So your opinion or view on this issue of frequent changes?
Yes. Thanks, Suman. I think it's a difficult question to answer because it's very much driven by India's policy imperatives. Right? I think that's really the core driver. And going back to the point Jamie has made, I mean, change, rapid change, frequent change, it's all justifiable as long as there's a sensible policy reason driving it. Right? And that must be clearly front and center in analysis. I personally speaking for myself, I would classify change into two buckets. So if it's going back to the language you used, if it's a tectonic shift in legislation, I would be very cautious. Because insolvency law, by definition, in the environment in which it operates, requires reforms to bed in, for you to observe, for you to understand how it's all working out, learn from the experience, and then consider what needs to be done. So if it's tectonic, I would ask the question whether it's really something we need to do while we're still in the learning process. If it's tweaks, which is the second bucket, then I think the argument is a lot stronger. You need to make adjustments because you see something happening on the grounds. Courts might have observed the issue, a judgment might come out and observe the problem. That needs to be resolved very quickly. Otherwise, it's going to fester and grow and become a bigger issue. Those amendments are fine. So I think you need to bear those considerations in mind. I mean, going back to the Singapore experience, and you mentioned, we went through a massive reform. We started in 2013 with an overhaul of the legislation. And then from a cross-border insolvency perspective, the 2016-2017 reforms were the big change that we undertook. We went through improvements in 2020, and we are now looking at further improvements, which are under consideration, which I can't share at this point in time, in 2023. So that's over 6 years. We've done two, I would say, material evaluations of what the process has been like. But if it's too frequent, I would ask the question why.
Okay. All right. Professor Van, I mean, of course, Singapore perspective, Judge Ramesh did talk about from a Hong Kong perspective, or in general, as an expert, as someone who understands and studies so many jurisdictions.
Okay, so let me just share with you. My co-authors and I are working on what's the impact of bankruptcy law reforms ex ante on the lending market. We looked at several EU jurisdictions that have adopted the changes since between 2005 to 2015. When we look at the changes, you can see that changes which are regarded as weakening creditor rights. What happens is that the ex ante, the market adjusts, and it can adjust in very unexpected ways. So, for example, you would expect that the cost of borrowing may inch up, but what we found also is that the debt structure changes. So actually, the debtors would adopt more diversified debt structures. And even in terms of the sort of the covenants that goes into the loan documentation, we don't see more covenants changing, but we see the tenure of the loans shortening. So these changes would have a profound effect ex ante on the lending market. So that goes back to the point, if we are making very fundamental changes to bankruptcy law, that can be seen as either weakening creditor rights or strengthening creditor rights, it has impact, and sometimes in very unexpected ways. The other area which we also saw impact is in relation to it affects firms differently. It has the heterogeneous effect. So some firms which are more prone to default, firms which have a lot more tangible assets, they will also be affected differently by the reforms. So the importance of these companies to the economy has to be taken into account. So there are many cases of very unintended consequences. So again, I would caution fundamental changes, something to bear in mind because the lending market adjusts and sometimes it adjusts in unexpected ways.
Okay. So, I mean, of course, what I mentioned about the fundamental changes, we were not really looking at the departure from the basic fabric of the law. It was not to distort what you consider as the fundamental principles, barring one, a bit controversial one, which you presented a paper on and argued very much against that. And I think that's the beauty of our consultative process, that, you know, there is a demand from a section of the market, the policymakers hear it, put it in a discussion paper, but invite comments. And there are people like you who are also part of that consultative with the Insolvency Law Academy, but still present a paper or support a paper which doesn't support that idea. And I think that consultation process gives the comfort that if you are making a departure, those who understand or who appreciate the consequences would respond to the degree where it gets the attention of the government and the policymakers at the right place. But I'm sure you want to make a comment on this. And then, of course, I'll go to Nawad also, a very quick comment on this as a regulator, because, you know, as a central bank governor, as also a former minister of finance, you know, what was his take on it? But before I come to you, Nawad, just a quick comment from Behram on this.
Sure. Thank you so much. And you all may be surprised because I'm certainly not a global expert, unlike everyone else, not a thought leader. I'm here thanks to the kindness of IBBI and Sumant. So apologies for that. Very quickly, what I think is I completely agree with all the speakers that if it's a fundamental change, and as Sumant says, we've not had too many really fundamental changes, you really think seriously, because that is going to affect the credit markets and the banking system as a whole. But I actually believe there has been some criticism that we've changed too often. I think 6 amendments. You can do the maths. Jamie said they've done 100 and it's been 40 or 50 years. So it's pretty much we are on track. And the world, whether we like it or not, is so much more volatile that we would be crazy not to make the tweaks. If we see a problem, how can you not fix it? And again, very quickly, if the court fixes it, nothing like it. Yeah. It's not efficient that every time there's a decision like we talked about, you need to change the law. The best is if the court takes care of it, and we really hope that they do, but otherwise our hands are tied. So, and in terms of the changes, I think we are coming to those, but there are a bunch of changes we really need, including the admission is choked up. There has to be clean bidding system. The exit is kind of choked up. So these are all great changes. And
we'll discuss this as we go. So Nawad, very quick, a few comments by you. I mean, as someone who has been a regulator himself, in a market very close as our neighbor. What is your take on the frequency of changes or tweaks, whether they're substantial, substantive, they're procedural or material? So your comments, please.
Actually, Suman, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be joining with you as well as all the other panelists. Even though it's virtually, I'm really learning a lot in the few minutes that I've been listening to all of you itself. What I want to tell you is these are laws which are evolving regularly. There are so many different cases, so many different issues, so many different new conditions that emanate as a result of the global conditions that are changing all the time. The laws sometimes have to keep pace with the developments in society. And that's one of the bigger challenges that we're all facing, because the laws also have to keep pace with the social changes. And when the social changes are taking place, the law cannot lag behind. So whether it is a question of dealing with it after a long lag or a short lag is the question that we have to face. I personally think that in order to support the process itself, we need to ensure that the law keeps pace, particularly in the field of international issues that we are now facing. We find the cross-border issues that are cropping up all the time. We find that the companies are all now multinational. We find people doing business from one jurisdiction to another. And if there is insolvency or the need for a restructuring or a need for resolution, those need a lot of coordination as well. So the jurisdictions of the law will also need to keep pace. And I think rather than figuring out whether it is a number of law changes or not, the more important thing is to see whether we are keeping pace with the changes that are taking place. And if we are, I think whether it is too frequent or not too frequent would not be the real issue, but to ensure that the law supports all these issues that are taking place as it goes on.
Thank you so much. So, sir, thank you so much.
Sure. I just want to respond on the credit markets comment because I think that's critically important in determining whether chambers should be made or not. I would say from my experience, the creditors, and maybe it's just because I spend most of my time representing companies, so most of the changes, this will be terrible for the credit markets. And as a result, you can't do this. It'll be a disaster for the economy. Sometimes that's true. Other times it's not true. And sorting that out by the regulators, the people thinking about the changes, I think is incredibly important because they shouldn't have a veto, but their input is really important. But then most of the changes, for example, in the US, we've seen the creditors say this will be disaster for the credit markets, and it's been fine. So I think that's another dynamic influence that needs to be taken into account.
As I hear you, I think it's quite clear. The consensus is that it doesn't matter what is the frequency of changes. It doesn't matter how many are, how many of them are, distance from another or nearer to the other, but it has to justify the reason for which it is being done, and the impact assessment has to be fully appreciated. And in particular, how the credit market gets affected is something, and also some of the the unintended consequences are those also that need to be affected. But as far as that part is concerned, I think we're quite in place in terms of the very rigorous, very deep intake process that takes place there. And of course, we all appreciate that, insolvency law in particular is a live animal. I mean, it has to keep moving. And the point that Niwad make that, the policymakers have to be ahead of the market rather than catching up the market, in fact, in that sense, when it comes to these kind of sophisticated laws and complex systems. So let's just shift gear and now talk about one significant part that was in the discussion paper. And for the benefit of those, we may find the word that we're using could be different from what appears in the paper. They talk about in the paper about fast track resolution driven by the creditors. Now, that's the nomenclature which is used in the discussion paper. But in the world of insolvency, we sort of use it a pre-insolvency resolution connotation to this. And there are a number of ways by which you can do pre-insolvency resolution, which could be completely out of court workouts. There could be something which is a pre-pack, and the pre-packs exist in many avatars all over the world. And we'll hear about that a little bit from you. But the third one, which in fact, what we are seeing as is an effort which is being made at this point in time, the discussion paper is to marry the informal process with the formal process. As you all know that there is a Reserve Bank of India framework, potential norms framework of June 2019, which provides for an informal workout mechanism. But it doesn't require any intervention of the court, it doesn't require any approval of the court. So what is being sought here through the discussion paper is to marry the process that you do the out-of-court workout in the shadow of the insolvency law, IBC, through a certain framework that is created to make sure that it is working in a way which is the rules set for the process. And then you come to the adjudicating authority to get the plan approved, and the plan has to be compliant with the provisions of the code. But now this is different from the pre-pack, because the pre-pack, which you already see, is a debtor-driven process, is a debtor in control process. But what is contemplated here is a creditor-driven process in a way, right? So to that extent, it is different from pre-pack. For those who might be confusing, then where is the difference? And the way it is contemplated as to be different is that there's no admission required for initiation and commencement of the process. That probably would happen by operation of law, or what you may define as a fiction of law provision, which exists in many jurisdictions. We've had that even under SICA earlier. Of course, it was abused because it was debtor-driven. But since it is contemplated here as a creditor-driven, we do have some comfort that the abuse part perhaps could be avoided or prevented as a safeguard there. Now, having said that, the fact is that it is innovative. At the same point in time, it does offer certain challenges and has still some unanswered questions. And I thought we will benefit from your experiences of how, by understanding how do you perceive this as something. Maybe Professor Wan, I'll start with you. I know a couple of months back, or rather earlier in the month itself, you were back in Delhi. We had a session on something similar to this, but not exactly on this, where you spoke about the pre-pack. That was a larger session as to where the world is moving. We all see European Union in particular has moved to the pre-insolvency process. I mean, we have this paper that came out, which a Spanish academic did, which has become now the practice there. So what is your take? I mean, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, you see so much of that happening. So from your point of view.
Thank you so much. So the fundamental aim of a pre-insolvency framework is that you want to reduce the transaction costs when the company goes into the system and exits. And that's when you want to ensure that you have saved as much transaction costs as possible. Now, pre-packs in itself, or rather I use the word pre-insolvency framework, comes in so many different dimensions. And so if we start from the first question we ask is, what sort of governance structure do we have in mind? So if you look at the English approach, you have administration, in which once the company enters into administration, the administrator has a number of powers, and the most significant of which is that the administrator is able to have the power of sale and is able to negotiate the creditor. So what the administrator, of course, doesn't have the power is to over the distribution. The distribution will follow the waterfall. Now, in many other jurisdictions, the administrator or the equivalent administrator will not have the power of sale. You still need to go back to the creditors to get the approval. And the administrator's advantage is that you have a independent administrator coming in. He's an insolvency practitioner, and in which case he has the objective views on looking at that matters. The creditors would have some comfort in that, having an independent insolvency practitioner. Now, there are some drawbacks, which is that if you have a complex business which you plan to sell as a going concern, say retail, that is going to be difficult because the administrator may not be the best person to run the business until the sale happens. So the UK has devised the light touch administration process, which is done in the many retailers like Debenham Retails. So what I'm saying is that even in existing processes, the parties will find a way to work around it, to reach a solution, so long as it's something that's commercially viable and they believe that the company is, or the business can still be safe. So if you have a debtor-driven process for the reasons that you have mentioned, that can create other concerns. So the company, a independent resolution professional who comes in can act as the referee process. But the second problem is, how are you going to get the requisite information to the creditors to enable them to enter into an agreement beforehand? So what is the threat or what is the sanction? Or should there be a threat or sanction? So I think in order to have that process, there needs to be some incentive for the debtor to disclose the information to the creditors for that pre-insolvency framework to work. Then ancillary issues include what about transaction avoidance? Because a lot of the pre-insolvency framework, the insolvency practitioner may not have the incentive to actually investigate these transactions. Then finally, when it comes to the sale, how do you want to do the sale? What is the valuation process? How do you make it such that it is transparent and that it will eventually be approved in a way which the creditors don't feel that they've been taken advantage of? So US pre-PAX has many advantages because at the end of the day, the court will bless the transaction. So in the framework that you have mentioned, you still would want at least contemplated that the courts will come in as the final arbiter. So unlike the UK, where administration, we don't actually need the court approval. I think the final question I would ask is, when you trigger the process, must the debtor be close to insolvency, or insolvency is imminent, or is it really in default? If you allow an early trigger, if you allow a trigger where the company doesn't actually need to be insolvent or close to insolvency, you will encourage the debtor to address the problem early, without the stigma of being actually insolvent. So I think that's the beauty of the English scheme of arrangement. But on the other hand, if you have a moratorium or you insist on moratorium being put in, it is going to be very challenging to put in a moratorium in the absence of the debtor being close to insolvency or insolvency is imminent. So these are the considerations, but what I'm saying is that there are many hybrid ways to deal with the problem. And the question is then, what would be the best way which you think that it would be work? For Singapore, when I did the empirical study, a lot of the pre-PAX, I know the schemes of arrangement involve pre-negotiation pre-PAX is a compressed time frame. But more critically, in many, I'm not saying all, but in many of the successful cases, what is striking is that it involves financial creditors. The operational creditors typically not involved. If it's financial creditors, there's a smaller number. They can signal their approval ahead of time. Whereas if you have a lot of operational creditors, that's going to be challenging to get those approvals.
Well, actually, you flagged all the right issues, and that's what we were hoping to discuss. And when we had this discussion, while as a run up to the session, we actually ultimately landed up on these 3-4 issues that we need to resolve. But before I go to Jamie, I know what I mentioned sounded like a hybrid of UK and US, but just 2-3 distinctions, and I also in that process throw some light on the point that you raised, and so that Jamie can deal with that in his response in a more informed way in terms of where the thinking is. That one, I think Mr. Sudhakar Shukla mentioned yesterday. He's here, I think. Yes, yesterday in his comment as after Vikrant's speech, also where he made it clear that I think India is not ready for an imminent default position at this point in time. There are policy consequences to that, and I think that probably is not really happening. It is going to be a default-based situation, not imminent default. But I think what the thinking seems to be is still to evolve. We don't know that this is cemented as of now or not, is that the whole idea is to address the cases where there is no trust deficit between the debtor and the creditor, and the creditors would be willing to give the debtor a second chance and they would be willing to consider a proposal where there's no displacement of the debtor, or if it is with the pleasure of or the consent of the debtor. And also because this debtor has an incentive to happen it fast, because if 18 months pass from the default, section 29A gets triggered. So if he has to have a participation, he has to move in very fast. And then of course that also offers an incentive to provide information, make disclosure, so that the lenders continue to have their trust. And where also there is a trust deficit, lenders will identify only those cases whereby some corrective measures that trust deficit can be breached, right? So I think that is being thought, but the two issues for which Jamie, in particular, what Professor Wan raised as an issue is, when does the whole process get triggered in a way where one can say that you are in a pre-insolvency resolution process, and two, how do you link in the moratorium protection with that? Because in a normal CIP process or even a pre-pack, once the admission happens, consequently, section 14 moratorium triggers in. Section 14 is the IBC code moratorium provision. But in this case, how do you bring out these two elements? I think these are two issues that we will need to address as a part of the framework that may come in.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sumant, I just want to make one thing very clear, because what Professor said also, we are a default jurisdiction. It's not imminent insolvency. The minute there's a default, it's triggered.
Yeah.
I just want to make that.
Yeah.
You can go in for.
So let me, I'll make a couple of comments because this is all very helpful points. And I have some gloss on it. And again, I'm speaking from mostly experience in the US, although a bunch of our pre-packs, or sometimes we call them pre-arranged, are very much cross-border and international cases, but done in the US. I would maybe step back a little bit and say, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and for what purpose and why? Because I think that is pretty important. Are we trying to do it fast because it should be fast? Are we trying to save the money of a court process? Are we trying to save the noise that would be very negative to the business of having a court process without there being a deal, so you don't have the communication to the market that everything's okay? Those are all like really important things of defining it. In the US, we've actually have a lot of pre-packs, but our statute is for the most part silent on doing pre-packs. So we've kind of made it all up over a number of years, and we've developed sort of a course of dealing. The only thing that's in the statute on pre-packs is that there is a permission to solicit votes on a plan pre-filing. And so that's what permits that part to be done. Everything else has been sort of development by professionals. And that's pretty relevant because there's been huge room for creativity. Apropos to your point, Sumant, if there's a trust deficit, particularly because you're a default jurisdiction, but we have that in the US, we don't have a requirement for insolvency. But if you're trying to do some sort of pre-pack, and when I say pre-pack in the US, there's pre-packs, pre-arranged, semi-pre-arranged, fake pre-packs, I call some of them, because they do it and issue a nice press release, but there's not really a deal. But that's good to try to hold the business together for everybody. But when we're doing those, we literally would, for the most part, just go out to the financial. Let's say I'm representing the company. We go out to the financial creditors quietly and suggest that we think we need to restructure, and say, get together and get professionals and get organized so we can have a negotiation. Sometimes, rarely, but once in a while, we'll do it publicly and say, if it's bonds that are widely held with dozens or hundreds of people, we'll let the market know, and then usually they get organized themselves and come to us. So that part happens. Now, there is no moratorium or automatic stay until you commence the proceeding. So what really happens is, if there's a trust deficit and there's a default, so someone's not willing to wait and they want to exercise remedies, well, then there's going to be a filing without a prepack. So you need to convince them to forbear. Sometimes it's formal forbearance written down on a piece of paper, and other times it's just nobody does anything, even though there's a default. And we don't have a wrongful trading issue or anything like that in the US. So that's all kind of developed over time. And we've actually, in the last few years, we've done several one-day prepacks. But apropos to the experience in Hong Kong, this is almost all financial creditors. If you need to impair the trade creditors, very hard to do a prepack, because first of all, once you tell the trade creditors you want to impair them, your trade credit evaporates, and all of a sudden now you're going in anyway. So it's almost all either banks or bonds or both. One caution I would make, and when I said define what you're trying to accomplish, one of the experiences that this doesn't get talked about much in the US, but it's one of my concerns with prepack and speed. And we've candidly kind of pioneered these one-day prepacks. We've done 3 of them. Is almost by definition, by doing prepacks, you end up with what I call a suboptimal capital structure. And why is that? Well, in order to get a sufficient degree of consensus to be able to do a prepack, everybody needs to compromise. And that compromise often includes not cutting the debt as much probably as it should be. Now, that's not wrong or right. That's just the way it is. And maybe if you say speed is good, you've stabilized the business, but I haven't completely fixed the capital structure, that's okay. We'll take it out, and then you don't wallow in bankruptcy or in the courts for too long, and you hope it works. If it doesn't work, we'll do it again. And we have that's a legitimate policy conclusion. I don't think there's been enough thought about the suboptimal capital structure, because sometimes there's been longer bankruptcies where the capital structure has been completely fixed, but that's not a free lunch, because that costs a lot of money, costs a lot of time, more damage to the business because of all the noise for a long period of time. The prepacks, I think, are a tremendous thing to do. And in general, going back up, notwithstanding some of my cautions and qualifications, and you can live without the moratorium if you deal with the trust deficit. And by the way, even when you say there's a trust deficit, it doesn't mean everybody's got to hug each other and love each other. Sometimes bringing in the right other professionals and have the right amount of disclosure can overcome the existing trust deficit, because we have that all the time. If there's criminal conduct, that's one thing. If it's just there hasn't been sufficient disclosure, a lot of times that can be dealt with, and you're on the knife edge if you're in default, that anytime anybody wants to, they can say, I'm done with the negotiation. And if you're done, then we're going to run to bankruptcy court and file to get the moratorium. Yeah. So there's a lot of incentives on both sides for good behavior, even when there's a trust deficit.
Okay. So one question, have you experienced in the US where while the prepacks are being discussed, negotiated, somebody would go to the court and try to get an injunction or try to get some preemptive order? Anything of that kind of happens?
It happens, but amazingly not that often, because generally the company would know about it and would just file without the prepack. But it does happen. But even when that happens, the company then runs and files, and our moratorium is the automatic stay, which the word automatic is automatic. So it sort of overcomes whatever somebody ran to court to try to do. It's very destabilizing to the business and sort of bad for value for everybody. And so we strive to avoid that. Sometimes we say we're just not going to be able to get a prepack done, but let's have as organized a filing as possible and as good a message to the market, so we don't all hurt each other's value. And we'll get into the proceeding and we'll hopefully negotiate a deal there inside the cocoon of the bankruptcy court.
Got it. Judge Ramesh, do you have any comment to add here?
Yeah, so our experience is very similar to the US. I'm talking about schemes. So we don't have a structure or a legislative framework for prepacks, but I think the way we would do it is, if going back to Jamie's point, the pre-pack only works with regard to certain classes of creditors, and principally, financial creditors, the deal is an easier one to put together. If it doesn't happen, then the way our provision works is that you file and you get an automatic 30 days, but the filing comes with certain conditions. So when you file, you have to show that you intend to do a plan, and the plan has got the support of certain creditors who are relevant to the plan. If you don't, and that's conditioned in the statute. So if you don't have that, you can't file, and the moratorium will subsequently be set aside. If you don't have creditor support, then you have to file a description of what you intend to do in terms of a plan, and you then need to persuade the court that that plan is feasible. So these are all conditions of filing, and then there are other conditions that are stipulated in the statute. The real kicker is 30 days.
30 days.
30 days moratorium. You come back to court for an extension, and the court has to be persuaded to extend the moratorium for such period as it deems fit, and on such terms as it deems fit. So if there's a trust deficit, the court can appoint, at least I have said in the judgment about 3-4 years ago, court can appoint what would be like a monitor or a restructuring officer. And in making that appointment, the court can make that person his officer. So the reporting line is to the court. Of course, disclosure will also be made to the parties. So that gives the court control over the entire process and makes sure that the trust deficit argument is sorted out.
Nawad, I'll come to you at this stage to share your experience of any restructuring that take place outside the insolvency system. We all know, I mean, you and I have worked together extensively on insolvency reforms in the past. And we know that, Sri Lanka doesn't really have something which could be stated to be robust by international standards. But I mean, do you see a lot of activity happening outside the formal framework of insolvency in Sri Lanka, of course?
Yes, Sumant. I think what is important to recognize is, as all these gentlemen and ladies mentioned, is that there is no one size fits all. Every single restructuring, every single resolution framework is different one to the other. The trust deficits are different. Sometimes the creditors and the debtors have very bad relationships, sometimes decent relationships. So in a way, it is important for us to have a kind of a toolkit which will recognize that there are these differences, and in the case of certain differences as to how we should act. And I think what will be most important is to have a kind of a menu card, which is fairly extensive. It need not be confined to one particular situation only, so that the entire judges, the people who are involved in this type of activity, all have some guidance, which is useful for them. Sometimes the lawyers who present these cases to the judges in court would do so from their point of view only. And that is natural. And I don't think we can find fault with anyone for doing that. But at the same time, if there is a compendium of the different issues, the different ways it has been handled, what are the possible ways in which it could be handled, and how do you deal with these trust issues, how do you deal with different conditions, I think that should be a very important way forward for us to ensure that the timeliness is maintained. Because as we all know, in the case of insolvencies, in the case of restructuring, in the case of resolution, time is of the essence. So if we can get the timing right, and we can do it fast, and we can do it in a less acrimonious manner, the success rate would be definitely much more. Because after all, at the end of the day, we are looking at healing. We are looking at a solution which will be a win-win for both creditor as well as the debtor. In so doing, I think the vast arena of new information, new methods of dealing with situations can be very helpful. And I would think that when we go forward, these processes should be documented. These processes should have examples set in as well. And if we have a compendium of that nature, it will definitely be for the betterment of the entire.
Well, thank you, Nawad. I mean, I think the word that I got from Nawad was the menu list, that you should have more than one choices, because not one size will fit everyone. So what we're looking at here is there's a CIFA, there is a pre-pack, there is a creditor-driven pre-insolvency process. Then, of course, the scheme of arrangement that exists any which ways in the Companies Act regime. So you already have 4 in mind. And then, of course, under the Indian law, even during the liquidation, you can actually come out with something which is sale as a going concern, which could really be a resolution plan in another avatar, because you present a document as to and get the court approval in terms of how are you going to keep the concern going and how are you going to revive it, what are you going to do with the capital that you're going to bring in. So I can only see 5 already on the list, and which is good. And then I know, I mean, I just want to move to the next topic, unless of course you want to make a quick comment on this.
Just very quick, that the more tools in the toolkit, the better, because it's a complex world. So exactly like you said, in a way, just to keep it simple and so nobody's confused, is why don't we call it 2 kinds of pre-pack?
Yes.
So one is creditor-led, one is debtor-led. And so you choose what you want.
Yep.
You like a dosa or a dosa, you want a thali, have a thali.
Yeah. So right. So I think that's how it will probably shape up, because I think the discussion paper only gives a nomenclature what they thought was right. At this now, there's an expert committee which is looking at it. It's for the expert committee to recommend, and ultimately then we'll go to the insolvency law committee for all of them to decide the right name for it. So I'm going to move to the next big reform, although it's not really mentioned as such in the discussion paper, but it was a part of the colloquium. Sir, you were also there on the mediation, and you were a great believer of that as well. And mediation is something which we've seen as getting a lot of traction globally, becoming almost like a norm. From the IBP point of view, although it's not a part of the discussion paper, but they have constituted an expert committee to make recommendations for the mediation framework in the insolvency. But for the benefit of others, and also for your benefit as I come to you for a comment each, is that there is a mediation bill that was tabled in the parliament about a couple of years ago, which initiated from the Supreme Court, came to the executive. There was a back and forth, and ultimately it's gone to the standing committee. I'm told that it's alive now with a lot of discussions happening. There is a committee that the government has formed, headed by Mr. P.K. Malhotra, former law secretary, who's been asked to frame rules very quickly. And there are whispers that it may actually come on the parliament table in the second leg of the budget session, or probably even monsoon session. Now, which only means that if we have to think of mediation and insolvency in times to come, we need to keep pace with those developments and make sure that we are not later on struggling to find changes that we may need to make in the mediation bill there in order for IBC to accommodate itself in that framework. So there is a sense of urgency, and we thought it might be good to therefore add that as a question here. But I don't want to deep dive too much on this, but I certainly would like scratching the surface kind of a comment from each of you. Again, I'll start with Jamie. Sure.
I have no input on this, just one worry. So that's what I want to share with you all. Then you give is that it should not, if it's one more tool in the box, terrific. But it should not just be used as a delaying tactic.
Yeah.
So that's my only fear. So how has the world got around that? That's all.
So, and maybe I should clarify as well. I think although we still have to do a lot of thinking, but it's quite clear that mediation has to be used only where you are not in any manner going to delay or disrupt. It has to complement and support rather than stand in the way. I think that's the spirit with which one would look at it. And I think we need to find solutions there. But let's see, Jamie, in US, I mean, it's been so frequently used. And yesterday we were discussing, you talked about Judge Shelley Chapman using it so much and other judges using it so much. I mean, and of course, Mary Houston as well.
Well, so this is actually another one that is what I call extra statutory. There's nothing in our statutes about doing mediation. I would say over the last 10-ish years, in the relatively big cases, it's become not de rigueur, but commonplace and not unusual. If I had to put a percentage on it, might be 50% mediation. But the concern you raise is a huge concern, and I've had that. And so generally the way it's been working is some judges push it themselves, some debtors push it, and then sometimes some creditors push it, or sometimes all the stakeholders ask the judge to appoint a mediator. So there's a variety. And then it's become very commonplace for a judge to appoint as a mediator another judge who is not otherwise involved in the case.
But a sitting judge.
A sitting judge, most of the time, not always in the same courthouse, but sometimes from another courthouse somewhere else in the United States. The protocol is that the judge on the case is not supposed to talk to the mediator, who is a sitting judge. But to the delay point, in some of the situations, judges, the mediator judge has said, I reserve the right, and it's happened, to file a statement not disclosing anything, but saying the mediation's failed. All parties proceeded in good faith, other than somebody who they don't think proceeded in good faith. That's a decent amount of pressure on people to sort of behave. There's also the dynamic of some mediations are in the context of I'll call it a standstill on all litigation in the case, and you want to do it in an atmosphere of peace and quiet and not with the pressure of litigation. But there's other mediations where people are very concerned it's just a delaying tactic, and it's parallel with ongoing litigation and deadlines in the court, and the mediation goes on. And if there's a mediation deal, fine. And if there's not, the court things go fine, and whichever one gets there first, it happens that way. That is, if there's a trust deficit and while there's a mediation, that's a way to deal with that also. We do have private non-judgment mediators, and that's probably 30% of the situations. And this is where, whether it's a sitting judge or a professional mediator, who the individual is and their credibility with the various stakeholders and constituents, and their ability to sort of predict what the judge on the case would do if there isn't a deal is really critically important, because that's what encourages the parties to do the necessary compromise. And so if the judge says to one party, if you don't make a deal, here's what's going to happen to you in the court, and that party believes it, that helps get the compromise. If they don't believe it, it doesn't help move the needle. And so that's another really important dynamic. So people really matter in this. And there's some people, some mediators who have gotten a deal done every time. And there's some mediators who've never gotten a deal done. And there's some that are in between. So the identity of the mediator really matters. And we've seen, I call it the cream rise to the top, of some people are very repetitive as mediators because they're known to understand all these to and fro dynamics to help get things done.
Judge Ramesh, Singapore, of course, is been for many years now focusing on alternate dispute resolution, and of course, Singapore International Arbitration Center, the Mediation Center, and I think that it's almost like a national policy, isn't it, to build an ecosystem or a culture for alternate dispute resolution, and but how does it play in insolvency?
I think there is an interior question that needs to be answered. The first is whether or not, and that question is whether or not the courts have the power to compel mediation. I think if you don't answer that question, then you lose some of the teeth. So in the US, and Jamie will correct me if I'm wrong, I think Delaware and Southern District of New York, there's specific standing orders which empower the courts to direct mediation. So it's not a consensual process. So the court says you go and mediate, you go and mediate. We did not have those powers in Singapore until the rules of court were amended in April 2021. So Order 5, Rule 3 specifically empowers the court to direct parties to consider amicable resolution, which is the proxy for a directory power. So I think in terms of what India wants to do, I think India has asked the question whether it's that power should be conferred on the courts and whether mediation should be entirely a consensual process. In terms of mediation, there are two parts, and I think we've only been talking about the first part. We've been talking so far about plan mediation. So mediation in formulating a plan, yes, I mean, I think it has a role to play. The abuse argument is not so much an issue for us because the court has the control over the moratorium. So how long the restructuring proceeds is very much dictated by how long the moratorium is in place. And we set very short timelines, increasingly shorter timelines, as the insolvency process matures. So, there's no, I'm not saying that can never be abused, but the chances of abuse are reduced as a result. So planned mediation is one part of it. And that's pretty much what Jamie has been talking about. But there's a whole big facet of, a whole entire different facet, which is claim mediation. So you've got a debtor with multiple claims against it. Going back to the crypto example I mentioned, we had a filing in Singapore, and I won't mention the name, where there were 3,000 retail creditors. Right? So how do you adjudicate the claims? You can't have 3,000 claims being sorted out in court. And if you go back to the example I mentioned yesterday, in Lehman, Judge James Beck, when he took on the docket, saw there was so many derivatives claims where the valuation was a problem. And he directed mediation and introduced a protocol for all those issues to be resolved in mediation, don't come back to the court. And I think those are considerations which are as pertinent to the mediation discussion as it is to the planned mediation concept.
Right. I think you made a very important point. You need to clearly empower or have enabling provisions, but you also need to be careful in terms of where these are best used, and invest in those areas where, like you gave the example of Judge Beck, and also where the caution needs to be, and as Jamie mentioned. So Nawad, can I come to you at this stage? I know you and I have had this conversation last week where you said that I'm a great propounder of mediation and like to speak about this in particular. So can I come to you at this stage and have your views on mediation in insolvency or commercial disputes? So it's some way the principles can be the same.
Yes, Sumant. As I mentioned to you the other day as well, I have a lot of faith in mediation, mainly because mediation is based on the interests of the different parties. These are conflicting parties, they are in confrontation with each other. But once you get to grips with the interest that is being pursued by each of the parties, it is sometimes a little easier to manage this process. And a skilled mediator who has been trained in the process of mediating and then ensuring that both parties understand the relevant issues in a much greater detail, as well as the issue from the other person's point of view, I think it is sometimes not too difficult to come up with a solution which is a win-win for both parties. I've seen that happening in so many instances in Sri Lanka as well. I've taken part in some of those discussions, and I've always found that at the end of the day, rather than with a court of law, you have the parties with a much greater sense of amicable settlement type of action than otherwise. So I would think in the case of insolvency also, it is always a possibility that if we have a insolvency practitioner who is well versed with the mediation techniques, which also need to be learned carefully as well as practiced carefully, if they are following those, it is, I think, possible to come up with an arrangement that would suit both parties without having too much acrimony. And I believe it is all a question of that very important balance that you need to strike. That balance is the key. And the balance to be struck means that both parties have to compromise, both parties have to gain, and in so doing, both parties have to understand that you cannot have one victor and one vanquished, and they both need to have some kind of a understanding of that process. So firstly, there must be a much greater understanding of the mediation process within the framework of the commercial activities. And secondly, there must be skilled mediators who, in this instance, could be insolvency practitioners who could also then be able to generate a lot more outcomes which are quite useful for both parties.
Thank you, Nawad. Professor Wan, your comments and then we'll go to Behram. Yeah.
Okay, so I've always been fascinated on how you can use mediation, especially, I can understand it in the context of liquidation. In the context of restructuring, I've always been fascinated because you have so many different types of interests that are involved, even though they may be the same class. So, for example, if you look at unsecured creditors, there could be so many different types. But I think increasingly, what I'm curious to actually find out, perhaps it needs to be studied empirically, is how would you look at cases where you have an unfortunate entrepreneur as opposed to one who has been accused of defrauding the creditors? Because in the latter case, I would have thought that it would be very difficult to reach any kind of a solution compared to the unfortunate entrepreneur. But I must say that I don't have a lot of experience in this area.
Yeah. Well, I understand. I think in Asia, we haven't really used it as much, but it is quite forward moving kind of a idea, but one has to make a start at some point in time. And I think this is the best way of starting to discuss and debate and understand the experiences of various jurisdiction.
Oh, I completely agree. And I just think request NCLT that use the moratorium sword and be very strict about it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll move to the next topic. We have cross-border insolvency and also group insolvency. In a way, they are interrelated also. So I'll take them all, these two together. While again, group insolvency is something which we had sat on for quite some time. This was something about 3 years ago. A working group was constituted by IBBR, which gave us recommendations. It was under the chairmanship of Mr. UK Sinha, the former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Board of India. And they recommended that let's do it in tranches. First phase, let's do procedural consolidation. And in the second, we look at substantive. But I don't think it bought in the policymakers' take on that. And it's been pending, but now it's suddenly back because it seems that the policymakers are willing to look at group insolvency law becoming a part of the framework. And in particular, I think the thinking seems to be that you can't implement the institutional model law effectively unless you have the group insolvency also recognized in the law, because it will always pose some kind of challenges in that sense, and you will have to eventually deal with it at some point in time. So now there are two questions that I have on this topic, and we'll try to do it a little more quickly because we have 30 minutes only. I'm going to leave for 10 minutes for Q&A, and I want to hear Niwad before that about what's happening in Sri Lanka. It'll be good for us to know because there is so much learning and how we can actually share some of it with Sri Lanka as well if we understand. So the first question is, there is a debate at the moment out in the markets that, unlike in the past where you believe that unsettled model law needed to be copy pasted, the narrative was don't make any changes at all. That's not good. Just do it. But there seems to be a shift in the debate on that. And I have Aurelius smiling there because he is one of the school of thought that no, not necessarily. We need to localize that as well. And that's something which I think even Sudhakarji made a point yesterday that that's one of the reasons why the unsettled model law in India has been held up, because I think there are people at the top who are not really fully convinced that this could really be applied as a transplanted version. You just need to look at it more carefully. So let me get the panel's view on that. And I'll also ask the same question, and maybe we can do it together. On the group insolvency, I just need to have from you one headline issue that we need to watch out for as a concern and look at it more microscopically while you are implementing that framework as a learning from the other jurisdictions. I mean, we know the benefits, we know the advantages, of course, but Benham, I know you got the mic up already. So
just to add a question, that's all, to all our stalwarts here, is in fact, Sumant, as you know, Mr. Vishwanathan gave the then FM in 2018, the draft, so it has been sitting there. And now, as Sumanta said, the feeling is that both group and cross-border need to be done together. My fear again is just that because group is more complicated, the world is still dealing with it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It will just delay things. That's my only worry.
Okay, Jamie, let's start with you. Yep.
I think that's a good worry, but I also almost all group insolvencies that I've been involved in have been cross-border insolvencies. There's been a few that are grouped that are completely US-centric, but not many. And so I have to admit I don't divide them that much, and maybe it will cause more trouble. It's group insolvency is quite complicated, and divorcing that from the cross-border part, I'm trying to think through in my head whether it'll be less or more complicated to do that. And I fear it probably might be more complicated to try to keep them separated. And I would say the apropos to that, when you say, what is the one critical thing you worry about, and this goes to groups that are cross-border, but I think even for non-cross-border is if you just file one entity and you don't file all the entities, you don't have a moratorium on the other entities. Even if you file all the entities, if you do them in multiple jurisdictions, now you have multiple judges, multiple regimes that you're dealing with. If the rules will allow them all to be filed in the same jurisdiction, we do allow that in the US. We'll let anybody file from anywhere if it's related to an entity that's otherwise able to file in the US, which is almost any entity in the world these days, the way our courts have interpreted it. Then you have a more organized process, but you may have a enforcement issue in entities that don't have much contact with, in your case, India, in our case, the US. And then I don't think it's a good thing when you have a company in insolvency and the creditors of that entity are able to thumb their nose at whatever the court is, and you're not able to enforce the orders. So I think maybe that's more than one concern, but as a thumbnail, those are the types of things that we worry about when we have a big group insolvency and we say, where are we going to file it, and where are we going to have comfort that it can be handled in an organized way and the orders will be enforced and respected, not just legally, but sort of, I'll call it credibility wise, and there'll be a reticence on behalf of creditors to thumb their nose at the court.
Yeah. And also, I think a subset of that also is that if some of the companies in the group are solvent, how do you extend the moratorium to those? Because there's no default, they're not insolvent, in that sort of conflict with the corporate law regime and separate legal jurisprudence, separate legal entity. All those also come into play, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, that's a very good point. In a sort of counterintuitive way, the solvent entities, again, as I mentioned, in the US, we don't have the statute doesn't have a solvency requirement. There has been some judge-made law that's engrafted a financial trouble standard or a good faith standard that you need a good reason to file, but you don't need to be insolvent. And we've had a number of times where we've had a group insolvency and the solvent entity needed to file because that's the entity that supported financing for the entities that were in trouble. And a creditor who would lend to that entity didn't want to lend to it outside of a proceeding if the money was going to be used to support the group. And so for our DIP financing, we've had sometimes very healthy entities file because that's what provided the liquidity to the other entities. Yeah, so it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's not unimportant.
Right, thank you. Judge Ramesh. I mean, you adopted the ancestral model law, you now have judgments coming out on that. And now you see that, of course, the debate lately, a bit of a hesitation and even reluctance, some of the jurisdictions. I mean, as you see also in the body language of our discussion from the Indian perspective.
So, I mean, the question is on the model law?
Or yes, I mean, I think both. I mean, because there are, I mean, let's looking at it from the global point of view, because India is looking at the global group insolvency in the context of ancestral model law. So that's why it's a related question. Right.
So, I mean, the group insolvency issue is really a problem with the separate legal entity, Salomon principle, right? And the ancestral model law on group insolvencies did not deal with the problem. It's proceed on the assumption that we are separate entities, and it's really focused on identifying a control proceeding called the planning proceedings, to which all related companies or companies which are relevant to the group plan will participate in. And this requires, as one of the hallmarks of the model law, cooperation and communication between the various courts. So, short of adoption of the MLG, the model on groups by countries, it's going to be difficult to a coordinated response. You might have that solution if more courts adopt guidelines like the GIN guidelines and are willing to talk. That could be a solution. I touched on some of those points in my remarks yesterday, but it is going to be an evolutionary process. On the model law, I think the general reluctance is that once you adopt the model law, you have to recognize and you have to grant relief. And so to that extent, assuming, of course, all the necessary boxes are ticked for recognition. And to that extent, the reticence might be because some might see this as giving up jurisdiction, because you bring in someone else's proceedings, whether it's main or non-main, depending on the test, and then you grant recognition. And then that's the bigger question, actually, of whether of the reliefs you give. And those reliefs allow you to operate in your, allow a foreign representative to operate within your jurisdiction in the same way he would if it was a local IP. And that's where I think the reticence lies. And I think people need to get over that fear, because in the greater good, this is an important tool.
Well, yes, I mean, I think one has to give objectivity there. I truly appreciate that. Bruce, would you have a comment on the?
Right. So we start with the objectives of the model law of cross-border insolvency. You want to save costs. You also want certainty, and so the greater the departure from the model law, the less likely you're going to achieve the overall objectives. Now, but having said that, so we have the model law of cross-border insolvency. So we have jurisdictions, including Japan, Korea, who say they've adopted the model law, but they don't have the concept of a automatic recognition, because they say that under domestic law, it doesn't happen, even if there's a commit. The second issue, which is the more complex one, I mean, the first one is complex, but the second one, I think, is it really necessary to adopt the model on group insolvencies? Can you not have the current model on cross-border insolvency and look at ways in which you can fashion how to grant the additional relief that's been asked? I think in UK, they looked at the model on the group insolvency. There was the impetus to adopt it because the courts have interpreted the meaning of how we can get additional relief more restrictively, and therefore it won't really help the situation. But if I look at jurisdictions which have been more open as to the kinds of relief that can be granted as part of additional relief, including recognition of certain kinds of orders, which would otherwise not be the case, you might not actually need to adopt the controversial model on group insolvency. So what I'm saying is that there was variation, but the model on group insolvency, well, that hasn't been adopted in other jurisdictions yet. To be the first would make it, I think, very difficult to justify, because many people like to take a wait and see approach.
Nuwan, I'm going to take the liberty of skipping your comment on this, because I'm trying to save time for for you to be able to tell us about what's happening in Sri Lanka. So, if you don't mind, can I move to the next topic?
No
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. The next topic is, again, I mean, we'll try to do about 7-8 minutes on that, but it's a kind of a, if I may say, contentious, not controversial though as much, though some may also call it as controversial, but it is certainly a contentious issue. About a couple of years back, maybe a little lesser than that, one of the parliamentary committees recommended that there should be a code of conduct for the committee of creditors, and they just left it at that without really going further to say as to who should frame that code of conduct or who should regulate that code of conduct. But IBBI came out with a discussion paper following that and also had a draft of the code of conduct. But it's sitting there now for quite some time, but the debate hasn't really died. This is still up in the air, if I may say. Now, Beham, I want to start with you on this. I mean, I know there are very little examples in the world on code of is there being any regulation of the Committee of Creditors? So our answers may be based on personal views and opinions rather than experience sharing. So, but we all will benefit from that, isn't it? So let's start with you.
Yeah, I think this is actually very much India related because also the banking sector and the skew between public, private, etc. And also the provisions of IBC and the power it gives the COC and the financial creditors. But the broad feeling I have is that it's more trouble than it's worth.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been very, very diplomatic in your approach, right? Jamie, it's okay. I mean, just Ramesh, because you have a view on this.
So we don't have a code for COCs in Singapore, but if there's a challenge, we will kick out. And I've had did exactly that in a case which has become very topical in the last 2 years, a very major collapse of an oil and gas trading business.
Yeah. So, behavior is in a way controlled where somebody takes that misbehavior to the court and the court intervenes. So that's one way of dealing with. Jamie, your view on that?
Yeah, I would just say we don't have a code of conduct. We have for our official creditors committees, which are really not the financial creditors generally, unless they're unsecured. We do impose fiduciary duties on the members of the committee because they represent their entire constituency, and that's pretty disciplining. But actually what's developed is because people don't like to have fiduciary duties, they don't want to serve on that committee, and we have a lot of what are called ad hoc committees, which are informal, and there are no fiduciary duties, and that's where the real work gets done. So I think you're probably right in the sense of we deal with it. There's misconduct of various levels. There's conflicts. It would be nice if we knew where everybody sat and what all their ownership is of derivatives and credit default swaps and all of that, but we don't all the time, and we deal with it. I simplistically say if somebody's taking a position in a case and you don't understand why they're doing it, think about what would make that position rational. And maybe they have a conflict, maybe they have a credit default swap, whatever, but we generally just deal with it the best we can.
Yeah. And of course, just by the way, in India, of course, now it's well recognized, although it's not in the statute in so many words, but in various judgments, the Supreme Court has been very clearly articulated that it's a fiduciary duty, it's a duty of care. It was almost a function in the nature of a public function. And that I think is emphasized, underlined, highlighted in all respects. I think that is very well entrenched into the fabric of the insolvency system. But whether you really need to go to the next level is just the debate. Professor Van.
Once you impose duties and you have a code, then inevitably it will lead to litigation, and which will then generate a whole list of satellite litigation. But I think at the end of the day, the code, it would be good as a aspirational standards for the COC to aspire to, but not necessarily something that you want it to be actionable by reason of a breach. I think that once you cross that, you're going to lead to a situation where there's really going to be a lot of satellite litigation.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think at ILO, we have recently come out with standards and conduct and performance, which was like best practices, trying to raise the bar for the market. Let's see how the market responds to that. It's been very well received. In fact, in Australia, it's been shared with the insolvency professionals there and the policymakers there, but the market itself is very innovative in that sense. But let's see, how it shapes up. Now, Niwan, you can cover this topic also as you speak if you would like to. We'd like to spend next about 7-8 minutes to hear from you on how is Sri Lanka dealing with the current challenges as a result of the economic crisis, on maybe a little bit of, you could talk about the sovereign debt restructuring part, how the banks dealing with the distress and the pressures, and perhaps even the corporates. How are they addressing the issue of stress, and is there a legal framework already in place, or is it something which is being accelerated in order to make that happen? And any other comment that you'd like to make, please, over to you.
Thank you, Suman. I'll preface with a couple of very quick comments on the other two topics. One is about the model law. I think it's a useful concept because if you look at the accountants, and I happen to be in that breed, you find that we have what is called international accounting standards. So right across the board, all jurisdictions follow those international accounting standards. As a result, there's clarity and there's certainty. So sometimes in the case of commercial activities, such as insolvency, you could perhaps have a model law which goes across the borders, and that can be very helpful. That's one comment. The other is about the code of conduct as well. There is a possibility that once there is a code of conduct, everybody knows what is expected of the person who is involved in that subject. And when that is there, even people who are involved in the subject from outside can demand that level of conduct. So that's also an important factor in ensuring that people stay engaged as well as they are held accountable for the level of conduct that they should perhaps be responsible for. Coming back to the question that you mainly asked me about Sri Lanka situation. Yes, we are in a difficult situation right now. And in my view, it is something that we perhaps could have avoided, but unfortunately we didn't. And as a result, we are in a situation where we have preempted by saying we are not solvent. It is always a difficult process when you admit insolvency upfront, because then you tend to close other windows as well as doors, which may have opened for you otherwise. Because once you say we are not able to pay our debts, then you trigger a certain state of play, which doesn't give you too many avenues to depart from. So we are in that situation today, and I believe it is something that we might regret later on. But nevertheless, now that we are in it, we got to make the best use of going forward together with the challenges that have emanated from that situation. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, we have a deficit in the case of our foreign exchange, which has been triggered over a period of time due to enhanced borrowing at one stage. Then with the situation where we had after the Easter bomb attack, tourism failed. And for a long time, tourism has been not generating the revenues that we have been wanting to have. And then with the COVID and the lockdowns, I think Sri Lanka suffered a great deal, which made the situation a lot worse. And that could have been perhaps dealt with outside arrangements that we have been talking to other countries and bilateral arrangements. But unfortunately, that was delayed to some extent. And then as a result, the country panicked. And I believe we have got into this situation. Now, we have approached the IMF. We have approached the creditors. And as of now, we still don't have a proper resolution package on the table, although there have been many attempts at doing that. So we have a bit of a limbo situation now, where many of the creditors who may have otherwise supported are reluctant to come forward and support Sri Lanka. And at the same time, IMF is also delaying as a result of all the creditors not coming together. And that's also understandable because, as we all know, being in the business as well as resolution, how difficult it is for the minds to meet in a situation of tension. And I believe these are now matters that Sri Lanka is learning, and that is unfortunate because it is putting additional pressure. As we all know, when you do have a distressed situation, you got to have a very close stab on the timing with regard to the time that you take to come out of it. With the uncertainty that has come about with the delays in the process, I think that's hurting Sri Lanka quite a bit. And other creditors who are willing to help Sri Lanka, and I must, because we are involved in this conference in India, I must say India has been a very dear friend of Sri Lanka, and they have been very supportive of Sri Lanka and going out of their way to help. and so has China. Both countries have been very helpful to Sri Lanka. But at the end of the day, once the default situation was announced, both countries have found it difficult to come forward and to support Sri Lanka. So I believe the next few months will see a lot of activity in trying to diffuse this tension and go forward. And I believe that's going to be something which Sri Lanka will have to work on. One of the points that I would like to mention here is that in the case of Sri Lanka, we find that many of the creditors have different ideas, as we all know. However, one point that really came across as being a thorn in the flesh was the fact that the senior creditors and senior creditors who have all senior creditors like the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB, they do not participate in any credit arrangement to have a haircut or moratorium as far as their loans are concerned. Now, I think it's time now to review that situation as well in the case of emerging nations who are facing distress. After all, these institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, are 75 years old now, and they do have the strength and the capacity to absorb some kind of a shock in the interest of the global stability. So in that sense, if there is appetite for these institutions to also take some kind of a haircut or some kind of a moratorium by them, it would probably make it easier for the others also to deal with the situation, because their need to compromise will be reduced. Because as we all know, people do find it difficult to compromise, particularly in a situation where the global conditions have been rather challenging. And I believe that's something that we all need to look at very closely as a point that we take away from this distress situation. So going forward, I think Sri Lanka has its work cut out for it to deal with these situations. The global markets as well as the global institutions now also need to rethink the way that they would deal with creditors, with debtors of this nature, so that they do really come in to help the countries who are in distress. The other bilateral creditors will need to see how best are they as a group able to support these kinds of ventures in order to bring these countries back to health. And also, finally, the other commercial creditors also may need to take a look at this whole situation in the context of the global situations, the Russia-Ukraine war, the COVID-19 challenges, and the specific instance of terrorist activity that Sri Lanka suffered from. All those can be then taken into consideration, and perhaps a resolution framework developed in order to give that support as well as strength to go forward. I believe it is very comforting that you out there, Sumant, as well as your colleagues, are also interested in knowing what Sri Lanka is about, because I think Sri Lanka needs a greater deal of understanding in going forward. And that is coming from people like you is something very refreshing. And I hope that we will all be able to work together to find a way forward that can give this relief to countries. And maybe that could be a useful case study for other countries as well to follow in the future.
Well, thank you, Nivad. And I'll assure you that we and many of us here have been talking about it, and we will continue to be in dialogue with you in terms of how we might just actually take this dialogue to the next level, where we could actually get involved in some discussions where we could be of some support or some benefit in that process. But of course, that's for later. We'll come back to you and do it on an outside of this forum basis. We have just about 11 minutes, and I was thinking I had one more topic of the IP, but then I would deprive the opportunity to the audience to ask any questions that they have. So we'll use the next 10 minutes to ask any, to allow any questions to be asked if there are any, so that, yes, please. So if you can have the mic, please, Raghav, I'm sure you can speak loud enough. You can have. Yeah.
So this is with respect to the issue of the fast track insolvency resolution process, the out of court creditor-led process which we are envisaging. So as we all are aware that we have a lot of instances of willful defaults or promoters acting opportunistically. And as Professor Wan mentioned that if we are starting a process which is out of court and creditor-led, we need to give some incentives so as to ensure cooperation from the promoters. So can you just share some kind of some examples of what kind of incentives for cooperation or disincentives for non-cooperation, which could be put in place in such a framework, so as to ensure that the promoters or the management cooperates even if the process is out of court and that too led by creditors.
Okay, so I think Suman discussed that earlier. So if it is a situation where the promoters will work with the management, and let's refer to a situation where it is a honest but unfortunate entrepreneur, then in that sort of situation, definitely there's alignment of interest because the promoter would want to work with the management, or rather the management want to give the information to the creditors and to complete this restructuring process as quickly as possible. In situations where you don't have that kind of scenario, but it is likely that the business will be sold, then the question would really be how to set up a sale process quickly so that you will not avoid the erosion of value. And I think in those situations, certain types of businesses will be more prone to that. So my suspicion is that if you are really selling capacity, so for example, if you have say a manufacturing plant where it doesn't matter what the management is, but you're selling capacity, in that situation, maybe management is not so important. So it's more important if an interim resolution professional comes in, assess the situation quickly, put in place an auction process or some kind of a Swiss challenge to enable the sale to take place quickly to avoid the erosion of value. So I think the circumstances do vary a lot on how do you want to do a pre-pack efficiently. If you have banks that are involved, and they would probably have access to kind of financial information as opposed to other kinds of creditors, then in which case they have the requisite information, might not be so necessary to actually invoke a process to compel the debtor to get the information.
Jamie, you wanted to add a comment?
Yeah, I'll be quick. It's a really good question and incredibly important. And I don't think I can do it justice in the few minutes we have left, but I'll give a quick one. I think in the world of incentives, it's both carrots and sticks in terms of incentivizing promoters to want to do the pre-pack. And this is where it gets difficult in the sense of, I always say our debtor in possession system, we didn't put it in because we thought it was such a great idea to leave debtors in possession. We put it in because we thought it was the least worst alternative because of the incentive point. Because debtors in the US were not taking action because they didn't want to be thrown out of control. And so there's the nuance in the question of to incentivize promoters and companies to act before things get too badly. In some sense, they need to know that they're going to have an opportunity to retain some control. On the other hand, that if they don't act, they may lose everything because of the way the system works. And so that's kind of like some of the carrots and sticks, but there's a tremendous amount of nuance and complexity in there. And obviously on the creditor side, especially if it's clear the promoters have no real economic value to protect, you get the answer from the creditors like, why would I give anything? Let's just do a sale and be done with it. But then the promoters incentivized to delay that because then they're wiped out. And so you get that toing and throwing, and the incentives really are critical. And I guess I'd say in the US, the way a bunch of pre-packs have worked out is our version of promoters, we don't call them promoters, but shareholders or private equity funds, have ended up keeping value that to which they're probably not economically entitled just by evaluation. On the other hand, creditors have concluded that it's in their interest to give up some value because in the grand scheme of things, by making that kind of a deal, it maximizes their recovery in a better way than getting in a big fight or just suffering a delay. Because if you just say you're going to wipe out the promoter, then there's going to be probably going to be delay.
Okay, we can take one more question. So Mr. Shukla has a question, so if you don't mind, sir.
Since we are discussing about the futuristic reforms, and futuristic reforms comes with the complexity. The major problem today, as I foresee in the future, and I discussed this in ILA as well, that we are discussing the reforms within the neoclassical economic model, where capital output ratio is improved by passing on the stranded capital to more better usage, better technology. But we are not visualizing right now. Maybe some writings are coming in, but what about greening? These are the brown projects which are being passed on to use the better technologies, but not essentially the green technologies. So basically, no, I thought I have not come across any reading where internationally any regime is trying to have some weightage to give a green technology a chance as a successor to the brown project. That's my question.
Who would like to take this one? I mean, it's a tough one, though. I mean, of course, we see that the climate change and all the environmental issues are causing a cost, and you need to deal it with the insolvency. But the whole idea is that where is the transformation happening? So, but you have it.
I think it's a fantastic question, sir. And one way, I'm just on top of my head, is that there are wages for the winning plan. So maybe if we all agree, the policymakers, decision makers, COC agree that green is a crucial issue, which certainly it is, then in that weightage, there should be for greening as well and for green tech.
Well, that of course would depend on the dynamics of that particular case. Yes, there was one paper today, I think, on this issue specifically. How do you give scorings, or how do you deal with the environmental claims? I mean, it touches this issue, but it's not really dealing with that issue as such. But I think that what I hear from Mr. Shukla is that he's trying to say that probably there's need to write more about that by people who are competent to write about this as a futuristic topic. And I'm sure that as we speak, some people are actually writing about it, and we'll have more visibility of this going forward. Professor Van, unless suppose you want to share. Sorry. Last question, but Professor Van,
I was just going to say that there are a lot of papers on front loading it, so you don't wait till insolvency, but directors should be taking into account these issues at that stage, and therefore, if they don't take into account these issues, they should be held accountable as opposed to wait till insolvency.
So I just
want to mention, there's a growing body of case law on cause of action based on breaches of green obligations. So it's a real issue. So going back to Wai's point, it's actually a front-loaded issue these days. And because it's become a front-loaded issue, it also becomes an issue in the plan development and the consequences that it's a relevant consequence in the way we formulate the plan.
So, I mean, that's a good thought. I mean, I think we'll certainly at ILA, we should think about this more seriously at the Insolvency Scholars Forum and see how we might be able to invest. I know there was a question about that gentleman, and you have that question, but I need the go-ahead from the owner because we're just 1 minute short of 7 p.m. So you want to ask, and so we'll.
I'll take up the.
Okay, thank you so much. So kind of you, sir.
Very distressing. So I was wondering if, along thinking of the lines of Insolvency 2.0 or 2.3, shouldn't we have a global platform for global insolvencies, particularly for countries that go bankrupt and they have international lenders? Today it's Sri Lanka, tomorrow it's Pakistan, unfortunately. And there are a long list of countries in that direction. After the Ukraine war, you don't know how many more. So on the lines of thinking of group and global insolvency, shouldn't we also have country-based insolvencies? And in that direction, perhaps a body like the WTO, a global body that could deal with insolvencies, could be the word to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are platforms that yeah, that's of course.
She's suggesting a
yeah.
Bretton Woods system.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, yes. But Jimmy, I mean, you picked up the microphone, and you wanna.
I don't have the solution, but I will say, I prefer it. I don't know if the global body could deal with it because I don't see the enforceability. But I do think a lot of the old ways and the traditional ways of dealing with sovereign debt problems are not the ways that they ought to be dealt with going forward, particularly for emerging economies. And I think there needs to be a lot of new thinking brought to the table.
Well, thanks so much. I think we'll have to end it here. It's 7 o'clock sharp, and I am so sorry. I have my. So one more question. Oh, we'll do it outside. I mean, you know, this is my reputation issue. I end at shops. I'm known for that brutally. So we will have to sort. I'm so sorry. Take it outside. I have to lose the last 30 seconds to thank Niwad for taking the time out and being here with us virtually, despite your very pressing schedules. I appreciate that very much. Have to thank Behram for joining us at such a short notice. I appreciate it very much. And you did not have worried about you not wearing the jacket. It's absolutely fine. That's how it is. And thank you so much, Jamie, Judge Ramesh, for spending not just yesterday, but today with us as well, Professor Ranway. And of course, to IBBI for giving this opportunity to ILA for hosting this session for you. I appreciate very much the entire team of IBBI leadership. Thank you very much.
We thank our esteemed panel members for sharing a sagacious perspective and giving us all the necessary food for thought. We also thank Insolvency Law Academy for supporting this session and their generous support in organizing this conference. With this, I request Mr. Sudhakar Shukla, whole-time member IBBI, to kindly present a memento to Mr. Honorable Justice Kanan Ramesh.
Now you have two. Now you have two to take back home.
Thank you.
I request Mr. Amit Pradhan to kindly present a memento to Mr. James H.M. Sperrigan. I request Mr. Sandeep Garg, Executive Director IBBI, to kindly present a memento to Professor Y. Yi Van. I request Mr. Santosh Kumar Shukla, Executive Director IBBI, to kindly present the memento to Mr. Behram Vakil. I request Mr. Ritesh Kavadia, Executive Director IBBI, to kindly present the memento to Mr. Suman Batra.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We at IBBI and on behalf of IIM Bangalore extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the distinguished invitees for sparing your valuable time and gracing us with your presence today. We also thank all participants who have joined us online. Ladies and gentlemen, I request you to kindly join us for dinner arranged at MDC Woods. Thank you once again. Wishing you all a very good night.
Can you put Niwad on the full screen behind us, if possible, so that he can also be in the background of the picture? Is it possible to get him on the full screen? No, not possible. Oh yes, Niwad on the full screen, so you'll be in the picture. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Hold on. Oh, that's it. It's okay. Go back. Yeah.
Thank you.